War and peace. Rome had experienced both extremes. But what would the future hold? Romulus, the great founder of the Eternal City, had expanded her borders, subjugated her neighbors, and fermented the name of Rome as something to respect, a respect brought from fear. Numa, on the other hand, had shown the Romans and its neighbors that there was another way, a peaceful way. Under his rule, the city had acquired a new level of stability. Religion had flourished, the lands had been farmed, and a new kind of respect had fallen onto Rome, one of praise. If the successor to Numa would have followed in his footsteps and kept the gates of Janus forever closed, Rome would have had a very different narrative than the one we have been given. A fully religious city, forever devoted to worship, not war. Maybe it would have risen and become a second Delphi. Instead of expanding its influence through force, it would have done it through faith. But this was not to be the case. The successor of Numa would not be a peace-loving priest, it would be a war-loving general. After Numa's death, a second interregnum started. One of the candidates was Tullus Hostilius. Tullus was the grandson of another Hostilius, who had fought a fine action alongside Romulus on the Palatine Hill against the Sabines when they invaded the city after the Romans had kidnapped their women. Tullus Hostilius was a young man. He was driven by a drive to match up to his famous grandfather. In his opinion, Rome had under Numa been allowed to lapse into senility, and it therefore had to regain its strength by renewed military conquest. This was the man the people decided to vote for and which the Senate would ratify. Tullus Hostilius, in the year 673 BC, would be the third king of Rome. Why did the people, who have been described as loving Numa and his reign so much, vote for a warmongering candidate? Although we will never know, maybe the Roman population looked back on Romulus' reign with a sort of nostalgia. Romulus had with his conquest brought new land and loot to the city. Under Numa, the city had indeed flourished and gained a new kind of respect among its neighbors, but maybe the Romans wanted more. They needed something greater. Rome had also grown under Numa's reign. Even if the city at this stage probably did not feel cramped, maybe the need for more farmland was felt among its population. Because of Numa, Rome was also now believed to be protected and guided by the gods, even more so than during the divine Romulus. The Romans probably had a strong sense of faith that if they acted now, they could accomplish anything. But if they did not act, maybe the gods would turn their gaze towards another city and bless it instead. Rome not only should act now, it needed to act now if it did not want to become weak because of idleness and fall to another people in the future. We don't know what Tullus reasoned with for being elected king, but he most likely would have brought up some, if not all of these points, before the people decided that he should rule. One of the first things Tullus did as king was to give out governmental land to Romans who did not own any themselves. This made the new king extremely popular with the poorer classes. The land he gave out had been conquered by Romulus and had been passed down as inheritance for the reigning monarchs. Tullus said he had no need for it himself and that his subjects could use it better. Another reason for this act of generosity was probably that it would increase the soldier and tax base of the city. The only people allowed in the army was after all citizens who owned land, and with more landowners came more soldiers. Close after Tullus was elected to hold the reins of power, a series of reciprocal cattle raids got carried out across the borders of Roman and Alban territory. Alba Longa was the city that Aeneas' son Ascanius had founded when he had become king after his father. The city was now many generations later ruled by a man whose name was Gaius Cluilius. Cluilius looked at the Romans with jealousy. He wanted their land to make himself and his city richer. The Alban king concocted a plan where he would tell people in the borderlands that if they were to raid Roman farms, there would be no repercussions from his side. Cluilius was trying to draw out Roman anger. He wanted them to attack in retaliation so he would have a valid claim for demands and war. This is just what happened. After the cattle raids, Roman soldiers went into Alban land and killed some of the raiders and raided some nearby farms for themselves. Both cities sent envoys to negotiate a recovery of the stolen property. The Roman envoys were instructed to state the demands to Gaius immediately upon arrival. Tullus knew they would be refused, which would give him a casus belli for war. Meanwhile, the Alban envoys, after having arrived at Rome, not being as prompt in getting to business, accepted the hospitality of King Tullus and attended one of the state banquets. The Roman envoys had at this point already had their demands refused and answered Cluilius with a declaration of war, which would commence in 30 days. The Roman envoys returned to Rome and gave their king Tullus a report of what had happened. Tullus then spoke with the Alban envoys and asked them of their mission. The Albans, feeling ashamed of demanding anything of their generous host, spoke with embarrassment that they would declare war in case of a refusal to return their stolen property. Tullus answered them with this: "Tell your king that the king of Rome calls the gods to witness which of our two peoples was the first to refuse the demand for redress. Our prayer is that the guilty nation may suffer all the misery of the coming war." Tullus, who wanted nothing more than to go to war, had by concocting this elaborate plan made it look to his own people like he was acting as the justified party. Had not the Romans first gone to the Albans to negotiate a condition that would prolong the peace, and only with the evil Albans' refusal was war needed to be declared? The Alban envoys travelled back to their king and gave him their report of Tullus' words. Preparations for war soon began. The Albans were the first to take to the field. They took up an entrenched position 8 kilometers from Rome in what would later be known as Cluilius Trench. The Romans also started building their own entrenchment not long after. The two armies were equal in strength. No side wanted to be the first to attack and have to assault their entrenched enemies. The day passed into evening and the two armies settled down for the night. Unluckily for the Albans, their king Cluilius would die during his sleep at their entrenched position. Tullus was fast to use this to his own gain by telling his people that the Albans were already suffering vengeance from the gods for their wickedness. Their king was only the first who would suffer. Soon all Albans would feel the gods' wrath themselves. The Alban command would be handed to a man named Matyszak Fufetius. The cause for the Alban king's death is unknown. Some people accredited it to assassination. He had started an unjust war and led his people into a stalemate. Maybe some Alban soldiers who wanted to go back home hatched out a plan and killed their king. Maybe Cluilius committed suicide. Understanding that he had led his people into a hopeless situation might have been too much for the man. So he decided to end it all. Maybe it was the gods' wrath and punishment, an unjust and impious war against the Romans who still felt the divine protection given to them because of Numa's glorious reign. Whatever the reason for the king's death, the Albans were now in an even worse predicament. Tullus would now take the initiative and under the cover of darkness move into Alban territory. Matyszak sprang into action and pursued the Roman army. Matyszak also sent a spokesman ahead of his army to propose to Tullus that they should hold a conference where terms that would be of equal value could be discussed. Tullus, being a cautious man, accepted the proposal but set up his troops in battle formation. The Albans followed suit, and then the two leaders, attended by their high officers, met in between the battle-ready armies. Matyszak opened the conference with a short speech where he argued that the reason for going to war over cattle raids had been a false one, and that there existed a deeper reason for why this violence had commenced. He meant that, whether rightly or wrongly, their pursuit of power and victory was the real reason for why Tullus and Cluilius had started the conflict. Matyszak himself was just the leader the Albans had chosen to conduct the war, but it was not a war he had wished for. The Alban leader continued to argue that while they would wear each other down, the Etruscans to the north would look with an hungry eye. The Etruscans are strong on land and sea. They could encircle and conquer both our war-weary nations, Matyszak said. Both leaders knew that there would be conflict. One or the other would be conquered and enslaved, but could it be resolved in another way than open battle? A new plan was adopted and accepted by both parties. By a fortunate circumstance, there were 3 brothers, triplets, in both armies, which were all equally young to each other. These brothers belonged to the Roman Horati and the Alban Curiati families. Tullus and Matyszak made a proposal to their respective triplets that they would fight each other, 3 against 3. They would be the champions of their peoples, and if they would be victorious, their city would conquer the vanquished. The proposals were accepted, and a time and place was decided upon where the contest would be held. Before it could take place, though, the rightful procedure of treaty would have to be commenced. A Fetial priest called Valerius, a member of the Valerian family which would rise in prominence during the coming centuries, approached King Tullus and asked him if he would accept the decided compact with the representative of the Alban people. Tullus, naturally accepting, then had to stand back and watch the priest and an appointed spokesman perform an evocation to the gods that they would strike the Romans down if they broke the agreed upon treaty. The Albans conducted a similar ritual on their own side. The Romans, after being taught by Numa the importance of rituals and ceremonies, took this very seriously. They believed that Jupiter would look unfavorable on them if a treaty like this was broken in any way. The Romans, maybe a bit naive, also expected that the Albans would take the entire ceremony just as seriously as them. But not everyone was as pious as the Romans had become. The 2 groups of triplets made ready and marched out in between the armies who still stood in battle formation. On these brothers' shoulders hung empire or slavery. They knew all were watching and counting on them to bring their people glory and victory. A trumpet sound was heard. The brothers drew their swords and advanced to the combat. Swords clashed upon shields, and soon enough the combatants were locked in deadly grappling, their bodies twisting and turning. As more and more blood began to be spilled onto the ground, the 3 Albans got wounded, but one of the Romans fell to the ground, too hard to go on. Soon after, the second of the Roman brothers did the same, and as they lay there, life draining away, they contemplated their last brother having to go on against all odds. The last of the 3 Romans was now surrounded by the Curiati. The name of this last brother was Publius Horatius. He was unhurt, but against 3 other soldiers he knew he would be no match. He needed a plan. Publius began to run with the 3 enemy brother hot on his heels. All 3 Curiati were wounded though, so they would have a hard time keeping up with the pace of the young Roman. Publius quickly turned around and attacked the first Curiati fiercely. It did not take long before he was dead. As a loud roar of triumph came from the Roman army watching, Publius went on and attacked the second enemy, running towards him. Before the last Curiati caught up, his 2 brothers lay slain on the ground. It was now 1 against 1, but the hurt Curiati had lost a lot of blood. Meanwhile, Publius was still unhurt and elated by his victory over 2 men. There was no possible way he could lose now. Publius looked at the last of his enemies and spoke. "I have killed 2 already. To avenge my brother's ghost, I offer the last to settle our quarrel, that Rome may be mistress of Alba." With these proud words, he plunged his sword in a downward thrust into the throat of the last Curiati. The Romans were victorious. The Roman army welcomed back and cheered their champion who had won them glory. The 2 sides also buried their dead. The 2 Roman brothers facing the city of Alba, while the 3 Curiati facing Rome. Tullus then told Matyszak to keep his men under arms. He was predicting a future conflict with the Etruscan city, and the Alban forces would make fine reinforcement to his armies. The Romans and the Albans then parted ways and began their marches home. Roman power had expanded, and Alba was now their subject. On the Roman army's return, Publius Horatius was given the honor to march first before the rest of his army. He was carrying the triple spoils of the Curiati brothers. At the gates of the city he met his sister, who had been betrothed to one of the Curiati. Publius was carrying a cloak of his sister's lover that she herself had made for him. When his sister saw it, she became distraught, calling out her dead lover's name. That his sister should grieve at the moment of his triumph amidst the national rejoicing filled Publius with rage. He drew his sword, stabbed his sister in the heart, and spoke, "Take your love and give it to your lover in hell. What is Rome to such as you, or your brothers, living or dead? So perish all Roman women who mourn for an enemy." As Publius Horatius' sister lay dead on the ground, the people stood in horror after having witnessed the killing. Publius was arrested by the city guards, but Tullus shrank away from pronouncing the death sentence, which otherwise would have been standard for such a crime. Publius was at this point the most popular man in the city. He had after all saved the Roman people from slavery. To not get the blame for having killed Rome's hero, Tullus appointed special officers called Duumvirs to oversee a trial against Publius for treason according to the laws. All the evidence was there, so it did not take long for the Duumvirs to convict Publius, and as they were about to bind his hands and hang him from a tree, the king stepped in. Tullus saw Publius as a war hero and did not want him to die a criminal's death, so he urged the prisoner to appeal the conviction and submit the judgment of his crime to the people, something he could do in accordance with Roman law. Publius' father also stepped in and told the people that his daughter had deserved her death, and if it was not so, he would have punished his son himself. Roman fathers at this point could legally kill their children even if they were adults, because he had ownership of them. His father also urged the people not to kill his last child. Not many days ago, he had had 3 sons and 1 daughter. Publius was all he had left. He continued with a short speech. "Can you bear, Quirites, to see bound, scourged, and tortured beneath the gallows the man whom you saw, lately, coming in triumph adorned with his foeman's spoils? Why, the Albans themselves could not bear the sight of such a hideous spectacle. Go, lictor, bind those hands which when on but a little time ago won dominion for the Roman people. Go, cover the heads of the liberator of this city. Hang him on the fatal tree. Scourge him within the pomerium, if only it be amongst the trophies of his foes, or without, if only it be amongst the tombs of the Curiati. To what place can you take this youth, where the monuments of his splendid exploits will not vindicate him from such a shameful punishment?" Publius' father's speech, along with the young man's courage, and most likely the support of the king, made the people acquit their hero's crime. It was still felt that some kind of punishment was necessary for the kingslayer though. A piece of timber was suspended over a road, and Publius was made to walk under it. Walking under the yoke like this was seen as a ceremony of humiliation, usually forced upon your enemies as a sign of their submission. The place of the ceremony became a monument. The timber would be changed out from time to time, and the place was named the Sisters' Beam. At the historian Livy's time, around 700 years later, it could still be seen. Publius' sister was also buried, and a tomb was built for her at the occasion of her death. As Publius Horatius' trial had been going on in Rome, the Alban army had marched back, and its new leader Matyszak had to tell his people that they were now subjects of Rome. The people of Alba resented their new standing as subjects, and they blamed Matyszak for it. Matyszak had betted his people's freedom on a group of free men he had lost and was now facing the consequences. To regain popularity among his people, Matyszak started to scheme with the neighboring tribes. He told them to declare war on Rome and said that his own people would betray their overlord during the war. Rome would not be able to stand against all its neighbors combined. In war, Matyszak had wanted peace, but in peace, he now needed war. The city of Fidenae, who had been subjugated by Romulus, were coerced along with Rome's enemy Veii to attack their common enemy. Matyszak told these people that he would also defect with his troops when the moment called for it, so the Romans could be soundly defeated. When Tullus got the word that Fidenae had rebelled and that the revolters were marching with the city of Veii against him, he took to the field with his army and sent an envoy to Matyszak for Alban reinforcements. The Romans crossed the river Anio. Meanwhile, their two enemies crossed the Tiber. The two sides were now halted facing each other at the confluence of the two rivers. The Veitian troops formed the right wing of the combined army and rested against the Tiber River. The Fidenae took to the left, close to some hills. At this point, Matyszak had joined Tullus and was ordered to take his army and confront the Fidenae combatants, while the Romans were going to face the Veitians. At this point, Matyszak started getting weak nerves, and as the coward he was, he decided to neither openly desert or follow orders and fame Rome's enemy. Instead, he took his army some distance away from what would become the battlefield and deployed his troops into the hills. Matyszak decided to wait out the conflict here until he could see who would most likely be the victor. He would then swoop down and join the winning side. The Romans, seeing their ally withdrawing, started to panic, thinking the day was lost. Just at that time, a messenger galloped up to the king and informed him of the Alban's army's desertion. Tullus, seeing that his army was on the breaking point of turning tails, fought fast. He spoke at the top of his voice so both his men and the enemy could hear him. He told his men that there was no cause for concern. The Alban troops were merely following his orders to flank the Fidenaean troops and attack them from behind. Hearing this, the Romans found new vigor and courage, while the Fidenaean troops, scared of a flanking attack, started retreating to take up better positions against the Albans. Tullus quickly ordered an attack, and the Fidenaeans, occupied in moving positions, were crushed in the fighting. The Roman now turns towards the Veitans and continued the attack. The Veitans, first seeing their allies retreat, then being crushed by the Romans, had already lost a lot of courage. In the following fighting, they quickly broke and fled in disorder towards the Tiber. Some soldiers threw away their armor and weapons to swim the river. The rest, trying to decide what to do, were caught off guard and slaughtered to the last man. It was the bloodiest battle the Romans had ever fought up until this point. They did not know it yet, but the future had many more, even bloodier ones in store for them. The Romans had so quickly and soundly defeated their enemies that Matyszak had not had the time to join the battle. Instead, he now took his men down from the hills and congratulated Tullus on his victory. The king of the Romans made a courteous reply and told the Albans that they would camp together for the night, for in the morning Tullus would hold a sacrifice to the gods. When morning came, the criers went out and told the troops to assemble. The Albans stood right in front of Tullus, with the Romans surrounding them. But the Romans had gotten an extra order to arrive at the gathering armed. Tullus started speaking. Romans! If in any war that you have ever waged there has been reason for you to thank, first the immortal gods and then your own personal courage, such was certainly the case in yesterday's battle. For whilst you had to contend with an open enemy, you had a still more serious and dangerous conflict to maintain against the treachery and perfidy of your allies. For I must undeceive you, it was by no command of mine that the Albans withdrew to the mountains. What you heard was not a real order but a pretended one, which I used as an artifice to prevent you knowing that you were deserted, and so losing heart for the battle, and also to fill the enemy with alarm and a desire to flee by making them think that they were being surrounded. The guilt which I am denouncing does not involve all the Albans. They only followed their general, just as you would have done had I wanted to lead my army away from the field. It is Matyszak who is the leader of this march, Matyszak who engineered this war, Matyszak who broke the treaty between Rome and Alba. Others may venture on similar practices, if I do not make this man a signal lesson to all the world." The centurion seized Matyszak as Tullus continued his speech. The king of the Romans told his Alban subjects that he would mend the rift between their two cities, for they had once been the same people. The Alban population would become Roman, with all the rights that entailed. The Albans stood quietly on the field, not daring to speak up. Tullus then turned to Matyszak and said, "Yesterday you could not decide between Fidenae and Rome. Doubtless it was a painful division of mind, but today the division of your body will be more painful still." Next, 2 chariots pulled by 4 horses each brought up to the spectacle. Matyszak was tied, eagle-like between them. A crack of the whip echoed through the air, and the next moment Rome's traitor was split in 2 mangled body parts being dragged away in opposite directions. While all of this was going on, Rome's mounted troops had been sent to Alba Longa to start the transfer of the population. A force of infantry had followed suit with orders to destroy the city. The Romans carried out their orders with cold, silent indifference. There was no pillaging or destruction, no rape or killing. The civilian population was forced to take the belongings they could carry and head out of the city. As they aimlessly walked through the homes they would never see again, trying to decide what to take and what to leave, grief fell over the population. Soon enough, the Roman cavalrymen shouted their orders and forced the Albans to start marching for Rome. During the people's exodus, at the outskirts of the city, the families could hear the masonry of their forefathers being brought to the ground. The road was packed with refugees. Women and children were sobbing while the men carried the little possessions they would have had time to pack. Armed soldiers were guarding the road, keeping a close check on the people that were now supposed to become one and the same as themselves. On that day there was no hope for a bright future of coexistence in the air, only sorrow and fear for an uncertain tomorrow. Alba Longa had stood proud for 400 years. The destruction of it took 1 hour. The city built by Ascanius, son of the legendary Trojan hero Aeneas, had fallen to the might of its Roman descendants. When the Alban population arrived in Rome, the city's population doubled. An expanse of the boundaries was needed, so it was decided that the Caelian hill would be the place of settlement for the new people. Tullus built a new palace for himself on the same hill to ferment his power over the new population. It would become his official residence. 5 new families of Alban noble blood were given senatorial rank. These were the Servili, Quinctii, Gegani, Curiati, and Clueli. With the increase of the Senate, new room was needed for their gatherings, so the king ordered a new Senate house built, the Curia Hostilia. 10 squadrons of Alban knights were also formed and added to the Roman infantry. Thanks to the influx of the conquered Alban population, Rome had strongly increased its power. At this time, there were still Sabines living independently outside Rome. Romulus during his reign had incorporated a big part of that people into his city. Tullus now decided that he would finish the job. The Roman king used as his casus belli a situation that had taken place in a Sabine city. In the city market of this city, some Roman citizens had been seized. The Sabines argued that they were simply reacting to earlier Roman offenses, but Tullus took none of it. Tullus knew he could crush the Sabines with his newfound strength, so he declared war. The Sabines, being pressed against a wall, began to look for allies to help them in their predicament. They looked across their borders towards Etruria and specifically the city of Veii, whose population were still resentful for their earlier defeats at the hands of Tullus. But the Veii government held firm the truce they now had with Rome and promised no regular assistance. There were some men in the city who did volunteer to join the Sabine army though. More than this, the Sabines also paid some vagabonds in the area to fight as mercenaries in their army. Tullus marched into Sabine territory and a battle was fought at a place called the Mantrap Wood. Thanks in large part to the increased Roman cavalry and their relentless charge into the Sabine lines, the battle ended in a victory for Tullus. The Sabines routed in such disorder that many of them lay dead on the battlefield after the fighting was done. With the defeat of the Sabines, Tullus raided and pillaged their lands before he returned with his army to Rome, now more respected and richer than ever before. The newfound prosperity would not last for long though. One day on the Caelian hill, now often referenced as the Alban Mount, a shower of stones had rained down from the sky. A party was sent to investigate the strange phenomenon, and they came back to the king with reports that the storm was true, and that before their very eyes even more stones had fallen from the heavens and laid like drifted hail on the ground. At the same time, a voice had been heard bidding the Alban population to cast off the chains of Roman religion and return to the worship of their own gods, as they had done in Alba Longa. All of this affected the Roman populations just as much as the Alban one. A public holiday of 9 days aimed at religious observance and worship was proclaimed, and it was decided that the holiday should be repeated in the future should similar happenings occur again. Not long after the ill omens on the Alban hills, a plague swept over Rome. Tullus, who always had his mind on war, did not allow his soldiers any respite in spite of the current circumstances. He argued that the men of the city would be more healthy in arms out on campaign instead of idling in their homes. The people slowly became reluctant of his rule. It took for the king himself to contract the plague before he decided to disband his army and stop any plans of further warfare. With his sickness, Tullus Hostilius seemed to change as a man. Where once his only thoughts were of war and conquest, he now turned to religious matters. Any kind of superstition, big or small, he started to take fully seriously. He began inspiring his people to take part in religious sermons and rituals. It looked like Rome was returning to the days of Numa Pompilius. The people of the city itself also came to a belief that just such a return was necessary for the survival of Rome, a theory that the gods had abandoned the city after the people's rejection of spirituality and religion began to be spread around the city. Tullus, now finding himself in a state of panic, watching his life and city crumble around him, now frantically searched for anything that could set things straight again. He scourged and searched in Numa's old commentaries on rituals and sacrifices, and found a secret rite dedicated to and in honor of Jupiter, the king of the gods. Tullus, without consulting any of the city's priests, conducted the ritual by himself in secret, but incorrectly. Tullus Hostilius did not save Rome or its people. He was not granted a manifestation of the gods. Instead, he was cruelly punished for his errors, arrogance, and sinful ways. The palace and home of the king was struck by lightning, the weapon of Jupiter himself. Tullus Hostilius, the third king of Rome, perished in the flames. He had led Rome to conquest, riches, and prosperity, but in that prosperity he had forgotten to pay his fair share of respect to the gods, and for that he was killed. As a king, secondary, but as a general foremost, he had reigned as Rome's monarch between 673 and 641 BC, for 32 years.